Hi again, my dears. Tonight's story follows Waverly, a guarded debut novelist at Ashwood, and Solène, the brilliant woman everyone warns her about. In a house of storms, pages, and dangerous honesty, their longing becomes a lesson in staying when fear begs for the exit. The first thing I noticed about Ashwood was that the lake did not behave like water. It lay behind the house in a long pewter sheet, still enough to look intentional, as if someone had poured metal between the pine ridges and decided it should remain there forever. The driver who brought me from the station called it pretty with the cautious voice of a man who had driven many nervous riders up the same road and learned that too much enthusiasm could be mistaken for intimacy. I had my suitcase wedged between my knees, my laptop bag against my ribs, and an email on my phone that I had read so many times the words had begun to lose their meaning. Dear Waverly, we are delighted to offer you a fully funded fellowship at the Ashwood Literary Residency. Delighted was a word institutions used when they meant processed. Fully funded was a phrase that made my throat go tight in a way I preferred to attribute to gratitude rather than panic. I had spent the last year being introduced as a promising debut novelist, which was a category adjacent to fraud. My first book had been purchased, revised, praised in rooms I had not entered, and scheduled for release in the spring. People now spoke of me as though I had crossed a border. I knew the truth. I had written about longing with the precision of a surgeon describing an organ she had never touched. I had written women who wanted each other so badly the wanting changed the weather, and then I closed the document and answered emails with perfect punctuation. Control had been my most faithful lover. It never asked what I needed. It simply made sure no one else could reach the place where need lived. Ashwood rose at the end of a gravel drive, a converted estate with gray stone walls, black shutters, wide porches, and windows tall enough to suggest everyone inside was being observed by the trees. Smoke twisted from two chimneys, though it was early September, and a scatter of residents moved across the lawn with notebooks and mugs, performing the particular ease of people who wanted to be seen not performing anything. Or I knew the posture because I had practiced it. A woman in linen trousers embraced another woman beside the steps as if they had both been born under a blurb. A man with silver hair laughed too loudly at his own sentence. Someone stood under the maple by the drive, reading a printed page with the intense misery of a person receiving useful criticism. I stepped out of the car, thanked the driver, and immediately felt the house take my measure. Inside, Ashwood smelled of old books, lemon oil, rain trapped in wood, and the faint mineral breath of the lake. The director, Mara, greeted me in the foyer with 2 bracelets on one wrist and a softness so practiced it almost counted as architecture. She handed me a packet, a key, a schedule, and a warning about the 3rd stair from the top on the east wing. She told me dinner was at 7, breakfast was flexible, lunch was feral, and the common room piano was not to be trusted. I liked her immediately, which annoyed me. Being liked by me was not difficult, but being trusted required paperwork. My room was small and beautiful, with a sloped ceiling, a narrow bed, a desk facing the trees, and a view of a slice of lake through branches. Someone had placed a vase of late dahlias on the sill, their yellow heads slightly overblown. I unpacked with ritual severity. Clothes in drawers, books on desk, chargers in the outlet beneath the lamp. Notebook centered, pen aligned. The act of ordering objects has always comforted me because objects do not resist being arranged. People, unfortunately, come with weather. At dinner, I sat between a memoirist named Theo, who wore a scarf indoors, and a translator named Min, who asked me excellent questions and then actually waited for the answers. The dining room was long, paneled, candlelit despite perfectly functional electricity, and full of the soft violence of intelligent people trying to decide who mattered. I had barely taken my first sip of wine when Theo leaned close enough for confidentiality and asked, "Have you met Solène yet?" The name arrived without surname, like a city or a storm. I said I had not. His eyebrows lifted with the theatrical restraint of a man who had been waiting for a door to open. "You will. Everyone does." Min, who had been buttering bread with calm ferocity, said, "Do not listen to him." Then, after a beat, she added, "But also, maybe listen a little." I smiled the way women smile when they are being warned about a person by people who cannot help wanting to talk about her. Is she the resident ghost? Theo laughed. Worse. A novelist. 3 awards, 5 languages, terrible coffee manners. Min said, "She is not terrible. She is simply exacting." Theo turned his glass by the stem. "She'll take an interest in you, and you'll think it means something. Then she'll move on, and you'll spend a year figuring out what happened." There it was, the first stone dropped into water. I had professionally decided opinions about unsolicited warnings. They were usually less about the danger of the person described than the injury of the person speaking. I filed his comment under atmospheric gossip with a subfolder for ego. 10 minutes later, at the other end of the table, a playwright named Althea said, without introduction, "You are new, so someone should tell you about Solène." 15 minutes after that, while I was standing near the sideboard pouring water, Dara Vale, a poet with copper hair clipped to the angle of her jaw, murmured, "She is not a monster. That is what makes it worse." By then, I had built an efficient private theory. A brilliant older woman had loved badly, or been loved badly, or simply refused to become the moral lesson younger writers preferred. And now the residency had made a small weather system out of her. I was satisfied with the theory. It allowed me to remain above the weather. Then the dining room quieted in a way I would later recognize as not silence, but reorientation. A woman had entered from the terrace doors, with rain in her dark hair, one hand still holding a cigarette she had evidently forgotten to smoke. She was taller than I expected, though I had expected nothing. Early 40s, perhaps. Black silk blouse open at the throat, sleeves rolled to reveal narrow wrists, trousers the color of ink, mouth unsmiling but not hard. Her face had the kind of beauty that did not ask to be liked. It asked whether you were paying attention. When her gaze moved across the table, it did not skim. It touched each person with an unsettling completeness, not lingering, not performing, simply arriving. Then it reached me. I was aware of the fork in my hand, of the candle flame trembling between us, of the lake darkening beyond the glass. I was aware that my filing system, which had served me faithfully for nearly 30 years, had suffered a catastrophic failure. Mara said, "Solène, you remember everyone except Waverly, who arrived today." Solène's eyes remained on mine. "Waverly," she said, as if testing the shape of it for truth rather than pronunciation. I had heard my name said by parents, lovers, professors, gate agents, baristas, doctors, and a man at a deli who once yelled it across a crowded room because my sandwich was ready. I had never heard it sound like a sentence someone intended to finish. I said, "Solène," because I had apparently become a person who repeated names instead of using language. The corner of her mouth moved. Not a smile, a finding. "Welcome to Ashwood," she said. Then she sat down, and the room resumed itself around the damage. The next morning, I made a private decision with all the moral grandeur of a woman lying to herself before breakfast. I would remain professionally cordial and personally distant. This was not cowardice. This was boundaries. I had read the room, listened to the testimonies, weighed the available evidence, and determined that the safest way to engage Solène Laurent was the way one might admire a winter river from a bridge, with respect, a coat, and no intention of entering. I wrote the decision in my notebook because written resolutions have the dignity of contracts, even when they are signed by only one idiot. At 8, I took coffee onto the back terrace. Mist hovered over the lake in pale bands, and the opposite shore looked less like land than a rumor the world had nearly forgotten. Ashwood in the morning was gentler than Ashwood at night. The house creaked. Pipes complained. Pipes. Someone coughed behind an upstairs window. A finch landed on the iron railing, regarded me as insufficiently important, and left. I opened my laptop to revise a chapter in which my protagonist pretended not to want a woman who had already ruined her sleep. The chapter was good. That was the problem. It was too clean. Every sentence knew where it was going. Every ache had been polished until it reflected me from a flattering angle. I had built an entire career, or the suggestion of one, out of emotional accuracy without emotional risk. I was halfway through cutting an adjective when Solène appeared on the terrace, carrying coffee in a chipped blue mug, and a book folded violently open in one hand. My boundaries, still in their infancy, made a small, frightened sound. She did not ask to sit with me. She sat 2 tables away, angled toward the lake, lit a cigarette, read 3 pages, and made no attempt to acknowledge my existence. This should have helped. It did not. It did. Pursuit has its own obvious grammar. Absence is harder to conjugate. She simply existed nearby with a quality of attention that altered the proportions of the morning. The terrace seemed smaller. The trees seemed less casual. My own hands became theatrical objects. I typed a sentence, hated it, deleted it, and heard her turn a page. By lunch, I had decided this was irritation. By dinner, I had upgraded it to professional curiosity. By the end of the second day, I had begun avoiding rooms by instinct, which was humiliating because she was not, in any observable sense, trying to be in them. The first workshop met in the old library, a double-height room with ladders on brass rails and leather chairs arranged in a circle of temporary judgment. My pages were up. I had not dreaded it. Dread implies uncertainty. I knew the pages were competent. I knew the first 10 minutes would produce praise disguised as analysis, the second 10 would produce sincere attempts at usefulness, and the final 10 would reveal who in the room wanted to be admired for cruelty. The piece was from the middle of my novel, a scene between 2 women in a hotel room during a storm, one of them packing, the other pretending not to watch. They did not touch. They hardly spoke. Everyone understood this as restraint, which is often the word people use when they enjoy a locked door. Theo called it elegant. Althea called it devastating. Min had a smart note about the pacing of revelation. Dara asked whether the suitcase had appeared too late. I took notes. I nodded. I maintained the bright facial neutrality of a woman accepting gifts through a bulletproof window. Solène said nothing for a long time. She sat with one ankle crossed over the opposite knee, my pages marked in fountain pen, her hair twisted at the nape of her neck. When Mara finally asked if she wanted to add anything, Solène looked down at the manuscript, then up at me. "You are very good at denying the reader the comfort of climax," she said. There was a rustle, the room adjusting itself around what might become a compliment or an execution. I waited. Solène continued. "But I do not think the scene is about restraint. I think it is about punishment. Your narrator withholds, not because she is afraid of feeling too much, but because she believes wanting should cost her before it can be trusted." My pen stopped moving. No one in the room breathed in a way I found helpful. Solène glanced at the page again. "There is a sentence here," she said, and read aloud from my work. She had no right to make my sentence sound braver than I had been when I wrote it. Then she said, "This is the truest line in the piece, and immediately after it, you turn away. I would suggest you do not." That was all. No flourish, no cruelty, no performance of insight. She handed the room back to itself. I wanted to be angry with her. Anger would have restored hierarchy. Instead, I felt seen in a way that was not tender enough to forgive, and not violent enough to resent. After workshop, I walked to the lake because the house had become intolerable, and because I had the childish conviction that water could return me to myself. The path circled through pine and birch, the ground soft with needles, the air damp enough to taste. I made it halfway around before I realized Solène was 20 feet behind me, not following so much as occupying the same orbit. I stopped. "Are you stalking me, or is this path unfortunately public?" She looked at the lake, then at me. "I am French-American, not Gothic. I can walk in daylight." I almost smiled, which felt like a breach. She came to stand beside me, leaving enough space for plausible denial. For several minutes, we watched a heron lift itself from the reeds with prehistoric indignation. I said, "You made workshop very uncomfortable," she said. "It was already uncomfortable. I made it honest. That is one interpretation. It is the one I prefer." Her voice was lower outdoors, less honed by rooms. The accent came and went, not as decoration, but as weather from an older coastline. We began, somehow, with craft. Point of view, withheld information, the vulgarity of twists, the humiliating fact that sometimes the sentence one loves most is the sentence ruining the page. Then we moved to weather, insomnia, translation, mothers, the uselessness of residencies and the necessity of them, why lake houses make everyone think they are closer to revelation than they are. Conversation did not rush with her. It deepened. She listened in a way I had not known how to receive. Most people listen by preparing a place for themselves in your sentence. Solène listened as if my sentence had a right to arrive unaccompanied. I found myself saying more than I meant to. Not secrets, never that. But true things close enough to the border that I could see the guards shift. We walked until the house disappeared behind trees and reappeared from another angle. 2 hours had passed. My private decision lay somewhere on the path behind us, face down in the mud. At the steps, Solène paused. "You are thinking you should not have enjoyed that." I said, "You are alarmingly confident for someone who owns a mug with a crack in it." She smiled then, fully, and the effect was so sudden I looked away. Confidence is not the word. Experience, perhaps, with cracked mugs, with women who mistake safety for distance. It should have sounded condescending. It did not. It sounded tired, amused, and too accurate to survive cross-examination. I said, "Good night, Solène." "Good night, Waverly." She went inside first. I stayed on the porch until the lake went black and admitted to myself, with the grave reluctance of a prosecutor dropping charges, that professional cordiality had already failed. The early days at Ashwood acquired a rhythm so delicate it made me suspicious. Breakfast at the long table with coffee that tasted faintly of smoke and institutional apology. Mornings at my desk, the lake appearing between branches whenever the wind rearranged the leaves. Lunch assembled from bread, apples, hard cheese, and whatever guilt the kitchen staff had left unattended. Afternoons of workshop, reading, or walks on the path where the ground held the previous night's rain like a secret. Evenings in the common room, where residents occupied chairs with the wounded entitlement of artists, believing fatigue made them interesting. Through all of it, Solène remained both present and unreachable. She did not flirt. That would have been manageable. She did not corner me, praise me excessively, manufacture intimacy, or ask questions with hooks in them. She simply noticed. If I poured wine and stopped half an inch too soon, she raised an eyebrow but said nothing. If someone summarized my work in a way that flattened it into marketable grief, she looked at me across the room with a flicker of dry condolence. If I made a joke under my breath, she heard it, and her mouth answered before the rest of her face agreed. It was unbearable because it had no obvious offense. I could not accuse her of making me feel chosen. She had done nothing so cheap. Yet when she turned her attention on me, the room around us seemed to lose its legal standing. One evening, after a visiting editor gave a talk about building a sustainable literary career, which appeared to mean becoming less inconvenient to people with budgets, I found Solène in the kitchen, attempting to open a jar of olives with murderous concentration. I watched from the doorway for longer than politeness allowed. "Do awards not come with jar privileges?" I asked. She did not look up. "Only the larger prizes. The small ones come with tote bags and lifelong resentment." She handed me the jar. I opened it immediately, which pleased me in a primitive way I chose not to examine. Solène accepted it back with a nod. "Thank you," I said. "I will add this to my list of professional accomplishments." "You should. It may prove more useful than publication." She leaned against the counter, eating an olive with the seriousness of a woman receiving news. The kitchen was dim except for the light over the stove. Rain ticked at the windows. Somewhere above us, a radiator knocked once, then again, like someone politely requesting entry from another century. I asked what her fourth book was about because it seemed safer than asking what she had done to make everyone speak of her as if she were a country they had barely escaped. She said, "A woman who returns to the town where she was happy and discovers happiness has no memory of her." I said, "That is either beautiful or a lawsuit against joy." "Both, I hope." "Is it going well?" "No." Then, after a pause, she added, "Which means it may be alive." I disliked how much I understood that. We stood there, passing the jar between us, talking about drafts that failed because they were obedient. When Theo came in and found us laughing, his eyes performed a small, solemn funeral for me. I ignored him. The next day, he made a point of sitting beside me after dinner. "You are enjoying yourself," he said. "Astute. I'm sure the MacArthur call is imminent." "I mean with her?" His voice softened in a way that made me less inclined to be cruel. I folded my napkin. "Theo, I promise you I am capable of having a conversation with a woman without handing over my vital organs." He looked toward the terrace doors, where Solène stood smoking with Althea, her profile cut in half by porch light. "That is what everyone thinks." I laughed, because the alternative was admitting the sentence had entered me. Later that night, I lay in bed, listening to the house settle around its temporary inhabitants, and wondered what people meant when they called someone dangerous. I had known obvious danger. Men who mistook persistence for romance. Women who loved the chase more than the person. Editors with kind voices and butcher instincts. Families who used concern as a leash. Solène was not that. Solène did not press. She did not promise. She did not place herself where I had not invited her. The danger, if it existed, lived in something less defensible. The fact that she made falseness feel physically exhausting. Around her, my composure did not shatter. It simply became heavy. On the 9th day, Dara found me in the conservatory, where I had gone to read and instead spent 20 minutes watching condensation gather on the glass. The conservatory was full of plants no one knew how to care for and furniture that suggested the previous owners had once expected ladies to faint there. Dara carried a mug of tea and the guarded expression of a person who had decided honesty was kinder than silence and less comfortable than either. "May I sit?" she asked. I gestured to the wicker chair opposite. She sat, folded one leg beneath her, and stared through the glass at the rain bruising the lawn. "I dated Solène for 6 weeks at a residency in Vermont," she said. No preface, no apology. I appreciated that. I said, "I had gathered there was history. Everyone here gathers things. It is why the floors are so dusty." Her smile was brief. "I am not warning you because I want to punish her. I don't. She was, in many ways, extraordinary with me. Present in a way I had not experienced. She read everything I gave her. She remembered passing things I had said weeks earlier. She noticed when I was tired before I knew I was tired. When my father had surgery, she sat with me through the phone calls and translated the doctor's evasions into something I could survive." Dara turned the mug in her hands. Then one morning she was gone, while still sitting beside me. I do not know how else to describe it. The body stayed, the attention left. I kept reaching for someone who had stepped out of the room without moving. Did you ask why? Of course. What did she say? Dara looked at me then. She said I had started loving a woman she could not be. I thought it was cruel. Maybe it was. Maybe it was also true. Both possibilities have made it difficult to be uncomplicatedly angry. The rain struck harder, filling the conservatory with a sound like applause for failure. Dara's voice did not tremble. That made it worse. The problem isn't that she's cold. Cold is simple. The problem is she makes you feel like you're the only person in the world, and then you find out she can do that for everyone. Because it is not seduction to her. It is how she is when she is present. and presence feels like a vow when you are starving. I had no clever answer. Dara was not trying to recruit me into resentment. She was placing a lit candle at the edge of a stair. I said, "Thank you for telling me." She nodded. "I hope you are different," she said, and the words were not bitter. I hope she is. After she left, I remained in the conservatory until the tea she had not finished cooled to the color of weak amber. That afternoon, I returned to my room and wrote 4 pages of my novel in one sitting, all of them about a woman who refuses to be a door. Not a locked door, not an open one, not a threshold for someone else's becoming. A woman made of wall, window, roof, and weather. A house no one could enter simply because they knew how to knock. The pages frightened me because they were not elegant. They had splinters. Sentences ran too long. Images arrived raw, carrying dirt on their hems. When I finished, my hands shook. I told myself it was coffee. It was not coffee. At dinner, Solène looked at me once from the other end of the table, and I knew she knew something had shifted. She did not ask. Her restraint irritated me so intensely I had to admire it. That night, I dreamed of the lake rising silently up the stairs, filling every room without breaking a single object, until I woke with my heart punching at my ribs and the taste of rain in my mouth. The storm arrived on a Thursday with theatrical timing, just after a dinner during which a critic from the city had explained with priestly sadness that fiction was losing its appetite for difficulty. The sky had been low all day, the color of tarnished spoons, and the air moved through the house in warm, unsettled drafts. By dessert, thunder had begun to roll beyond the ridge, long and intimate, as if the mountains were rearranging furniture. Writers, despite our professional dependence on metaphor, are embarrassingly literal about weather. Everyone became more attractive to themselves at once. People drifted to windows. Someone quoted a poet. Someone else said, "This is good for work," with the solemnity of a farmer welcoming rain after drought. I wanted to be above it, but the truth was that storms suited me. They gave the world permission to sound the way my interior life usually did. At 9, the power went out across the estate. The house exhaled. For a moment, there was only thunder, then the small, startled noises of adults deprived of electricity. Laughter, curses, chairs scraping, the quick search for phones. Mara appeared with candles as if she had been waiting years to justify their quantity. The common room filled with wavering light. The portraits on the walls, all dead ashwoods with narrow mouths and real estate, seemed relieved to be viewed in a more flattering century. We gathered there because people gather in darkness the way animals do, pretending it is choice rather than instinct. Wine emerged. Blankets. Someone found matches. Theo told a ghost story that began well and betrayed itself with ambition. Min translated a Vietnamese proverb about thunder and then refused to explain whether she had made it up. Solène sat in an armchair near the cold fireplace, candlelight moving over her face, listening with the grave patience of a woman attending a trial in which everyone was guilty of style. I sat on the far end of the couch, barefoot, knees drawn under me, trying not to watch her and failing with the discipline of a novice. One by one, the others went to bed. The storm did not soften. Rain struck the windows so hard the glass seemed to breathe. The common room emptied until the only light came from a single candle on the low table between the couch and Solène's chair. I should have left. I had built my adult life on recognizing exits while they were still ceremonial. Instead, I stayed because the dark and the rain suited my mood, and because leaving would have meant admitting I understood the stakes. Solène stayed because she was Solène, which by then had become both explanation and indictment. After several minutes, she rose, crossed the room, and sat at the opposite end of the couch. Not close. Close enough. She brought the bottle of wine and 2 glasses. The gesture contained no question, so I accepted it as if answering would have been rude. For a while, we listened to the rain. Candlelight makes liars of faces. It softens, conceals, suggests depths that may be shadow rather than truth. On Solène, it did the opposite. It stripped away the public edges and left something quieter, not younger, but less defended by reputation. I said, "Do you always remain after everyone else leaves?" She poured wine. "Only when the furniture is interesting." I looked around at the sagging couch, the ancestral portraits, the piano no one trusted. Fascinating. She handed me a glass. "Or when the person who remains is." There was no flirtation in her voice. That was the problem. She spoke as if interest were not a lure, but a fact, placed gently on the table. I drank too quickly. She noticed. Of course she noticed. "What is your novel actually about?" she asked. I gave the answer I had given agents, editors, interviewers, residents, the answer polished by repetition until it could move without me. It is about a woman navigating the aftermath of a formative relationship while returning to the place where it began, and about memory as a kind of architecture. Solène leaned back. No, I felt the word in my sternum. "Excuse me?" That is the pitch version. I asked what it is actually about. No one had ever asked for the real version before. People asked for clarity, market position, emotional arc, comps, the engine of the narrative, the wound, the want, the takeaway. They asked questions designed to make the book smaller enough to hold. Solène asked as if she believed the book had a private name and that I knew it. I stared at the candle until the flame doubled. The storm filled the pauses I would normally have filled with wit. It is about a woman who leaves people before they can discover she is not as deep as what she writes, I said. The sentence entered the room and changed the air. Solène did not move. I continued because stopping would have been worse. It is about the performance of intimacy, about being very good at making people feel understood while never allowing yourself to be witnessed. About the arrogance of thinking control is the same thing as safety. About the way desire becomes easier to describe than inhabit if you keep it at the exact distance where language is possible. My voice sounded calm, which was insulting. It is also about my mother, though it is not about my mother at all. It is about hotels, because hotels let you pretend leaving is built into the architecture. It is about a woman who keeps returning to a room where she once almost told the truth. It is about how almost can become a life if you polish it enough. The candle snapped softly in its pool of wax. Solène listened without interruption. Not the dramatic listening of someone offering sanctuary. Not the hungry listening of someone collecting future weapons. She listened as if attention itself were a moral act. I told her the parts I had not written yet. The confrontation by the elevator, the letter hidden in the lining of a suitcase, the childhood scene I had avoided because it would require admitting the protagonist's loneliness had begun before romance had a chance to be blamed. I told her that the ending frightened me because I did not know whether staying would feel earned or sentimental. I told her I was tired of writing women who fled beautifully. I told her I did not know how to write one who remained without making her stupid. At some point, my wine sat untouched between my hands. At some point, the storm moved directly over the house, thunder cracking so close the candle flame flattened. Solène waited until the echoes had traveled through the walls. Then she said, "You write about women who can't stay. Is that autobiography or warning?" The question did not strike. It entered. A blade would have been easier. I looked at her across the small, dangerous distance between us. In candlelight, her eyes were not black, as I had first thought, but deep brown with amber at the center, a color that suggested something burning far inside a forest. I wanted to say neither. I wanted to say craft. I wanted to say, "You have known me 11 days and have no right." I wanted to stand, carry my glass to the kitchen, wash it with unnecessary care, and go upstairs before the room asked anything else of me. Instead, I said nothing. Solène accepted the silence without victory. She reached for the bottle, refilled her glass, and looked toward the window where rain turned the world into silver scratches. "I have written many warnings," she said. "I have mistaken most of them for self-portraits only later." Her admission did not absolve me. It made the room less lonely. We sat there until the candle burned low, speaking sometimes, sometimes not. She told me about writing in French as a child, and English as a form of rebellion, then French again as a form of apology. I told her about the year I lived in Queens and convinced myself a view of a brick wall was romantic because the rent was survivable. She made me laugh by describing a famous novelist's reading voice as a velvet bag full of spoons. I made her laugh by confessing that my first attempt at fiction had included 3 symbolic birds and a woman named Eve, and that I should legally be prevented from owning metaphors before noon. Near midnight, the lights returned with a vulgar flicker. The refrigerator hummed. The house rejoined the century. Neither of us moved at first. The electric light made the room look exposed, almost embarrassed. Solène stood slowly. "Good night, Waverly." Her voice was careful, and that care did more to me than recklessness would have. "Good night," I said. She left. I remained on the couch with the empty glasses and the ruined candle, understanding that some conversations do not change the axis of a life loudly. They tilt it by 1 degree, and afterward, every familiar star is in the wrong place. On Saturday, the residency van went into town because even writers who claim to require solitude become feral when deprived of bookstores and coffee made by strangers. The nearest town was 20 minutes away, built along a narrow main street that descended toward a river with the earnest charm of a place that had survived by becoming picturesque. There was a used bookshop with a cat named Baldwin, a bakery that sold cardamom buns large enough to qualify as arguments, a hardware store, a gallery full of landscapes featuring the same 3 hills in different moods, and a bar called The Lark that opened at 4 and seemed surprised by its own popularity. I had planned to spend the day alone. This was what I told myself while taking the last available seat in the van across from Solène. Dara sat beside me and talked to Min about villanelles. Theo narrated the passing scenery as if auditioning to become a less accurate GPS. Solène wore a charcoal sweater, dark jeans, and sunglasses despite the overcast sky. She looked both famous and inconvenienced by material existence. I watched her hands as she turned the pages of a paperback. Her nails were short, unpainted. A small scar crossed the knuckle of her left index finger. I wondered about it for an offensively long time. In town, the group scattered. I bought a book I did not need and a card I would never send. I stood in the bakery line behind Solène, who ordered in a tone so serious the teenage cashier blushed and gave her an extra bun. "Award winners get everything," I said when we stepped outside. Solène looked into the paper bag. "This is not everything. It is pastry. For some of us, the distinction is theoretical." She tore the extra bun in half and handed me part without ceremony. It was warm, fragrant with cardamom and butter, and the intimacy of eating food from her hand, even indirectly, was so disproportionate to the act that I had to look at a parked Subaru until I recovered. We spent an hour apart after that, which I considered evidence of my regained discipline. I read in the square. I answered 2 emails. I did not think about her more than could be considered clinically significant. At 5, rain threatened again, and everyone drifted toward the Lark. The bar was narrow and amber lit, with old photographs on the walls, a jukebox no one used because the bartender controlled the music with authoritarian taste, and a long mirror behind the bottles that made the room look deeper than it was. Our group claimed a table, lost it, divided, reassembled, dissolved. Somehow, by the second round, Solène and I occupied a corner table near the window, separate enough from the others that accident had begun to look like intention. She drank bourbon. I ordered red wine because I enjoyed disappointing people who assumed debut novelists preferred gin. Outside, rain began lightly, stippling the glass. Inside, the Lark filled with locals, weekend hikers, and one man at the bar explaining cryptocurrency to a woman whose will to live was visibly leaving her body. Solen watched them for 30 seconds and said, "He has the confidence of a man whose ideas have never been alone with consequences." I laughed before I could make it elegant. That was the first thing I learned in town. Outside the literary atmosphere of Ashwood, Solen was funny. Not charming in the broad social sense, not eager, funny with the precise dryness of someone who had suffered many fools and taken notes for sport. She told me about her first publication, a short story in a magazine that paid her in copies and misspelled her name. I told her about the undergraduate poem I had submitted to a contest under the belief that enjambment could replace thought. We talked about bad early work with the tenderness veterans reserve for injuries that no longer hurt enough to hide. "What was your first book cover?" I asked. Her expression altered. "No, absolutely not. Now you have to show me. It is illegal in 3 countries. Solen, Waverly." The way she said my name by then had become dangerous, not because it was seductive, but because it was familiar without being entitled. She sighed, took out her phone, scrolled, and turned the screen toward me. The cover showed a blurred woman walking away from what might have been a train station or a grief-themed hotel lobby. The title floated in pale letters over a gray sky, and there was, for reasons no one living could defend, a single red umbrella at the bottom corner. I stared. Solen said, "It looks like a sad airport novel had an affair with a funeral." I laughed so hard I knocked my wine with the back of my hand. The glass tipped. Solen caught it before it fell, her hand closing over my wrist with swift, unthinking competence, while her other hand steadied the stem. The wine trembled, but did not spill. My body, which had been performing adult womanhood with reasonable success for years, forgot its lines. Her fingers were cool and strong. Her thumb rested against the inside of my wrist, directly over the pulse that immediately betrayed me. For 1 second, maybe less, the bar receded. There was only her hand, my skin, the suspended glass, the rain at the window, and the absurd terror of wanting something as simple as for her not to let go. Solen's eyes dropped to where she held me. When she released my wrist, she did it carefully, as if care could make the absence less obvious. "Saved the wine," she said. Barely, a tragedy narrowly avoided. "Literature has survived worse," I managed. "Has it?" She lifted her bourbon. "Debatable. Neither of us mentioned the touch after. Both of us felt it for days. I know because the next morning in the dining room, when I reached for the coffee pot and her sleeve brushed the place where her thumb had been, she went still for half a second before continuing a conversation with Min about translation grants. I know because I kept my left hand in my lap during workshop, as if the wrist had become private correspondence. Back at Ashwood that Saturday evening, the house smelled of wet wool, wood smoke, and the faint medicinal scent of old radiators waking. I climbed the stairs behind her, not close enough to be walking together, not far enough to deny the line between us. At the landing, she turned toward the west wing and I toward the east. For a moment, we stood under the yellow light with rain ticking at the windows. Solen said, "You have wine on your cuff." I looked down. A small dark stain marked the white fabric. "You failed then, catastrophically." She reached as if to touch it, stopped before her fingers reached my sleeve, and let her hand fall. "Good night, Waverly." It sounded like restraint had a taste, and she had chosen to swallow it. "Good night, Solen." I went to my room and closed the door with the care of a woman handling evidence. Before we continue, I just want to share a quick note with you. This version is made for YouTube, so some of the more passionate and intimate moments between these two women have been softened for this telling. The fuller and bolder version, with every private scene left intact, is available on my Patreon. If you want to experience the complete story the way it was meant to unfold, you can find the details in the description below. When I returned to the page that night, I wrote nothing about bars, wrists, or wine. I wrote a scene in which my protagonist stands in an elevator with a woman she has spent half a book refusing to name as Desire, and realizes that every floor the elevator passes is another version of herself she will not be able to return to. It was too dramatic. It was also true. I kept it. The rupture began with a sound I had no right to hear and every reason to misunderstand. This is how most private catastrophes begin. Not with evidence, but with the mind discovering a shape it has been trained to fear and then filling it with blood. 3 days after the bar, I woke early from a dream in which I had misplaced my room. Ashwood at dawn was usually kind to the sleepless. The halls were blue and empty, the floorboards cool under bare feet, the house holding itself in that suspended hour before kettles, showers, printers, and human ambition began their daily assault. I went downstairs intending to make coffee before anyone could ask me how the work was going. Halfway past the back staircase, I heard Solenne's voice through the half-open door of the little phone room beside the pantry. The phone room was one of Ashwood's unnecessary inheritances, a closet-sized chamber with a chair, a desk, and an old landline no one used except when cell reception failed. Her voice was low, warm, unguarded in a way I had not heard. She was speaking in French, too softly for me to understand more than fragments, but tone does not require translation. It moved around me like a hand at the back of the neck. Mon cœur, she said once, and laughed under her breath. Not the dry laugh I knew, but something younger, opened from another room inside her. I should have walked away. Instead, I stood in the hallway, holding an empty mug, and felt the first clean blade of jealousy enter so smoothly it almost passed for information. She sounded tender. She sounded known. She sounded like every warning I had been given had simply waited for the proper acoustics. The language sharpened the injury because it made her inaccessible, intimate, elsewhere. Then she said, "I miss you too," and I left before I could learn anything that might save me from myself. In the kitchen, I made coffee badly. Grounds spilled onto the counter. Water ran over my hand. My face in the dark window looked composed, which was rude of it. I understood intellectually that people had families, histories, friends, lovers, former lovers, beloved ghosts, sisters, godchildren, agents, sick neighbors, all manner of legitimate recipients for warmth. I understood that overhearing one phrase in a language I barely spoke did not constitute proof of betrayal, especially from a woman with whom I had not made or been offered any promise. My intellect, having delivered its report, retreated to a safe distance while the rest of me began constructing an exit. The efficiency was almost beautiful. By breakfast, I had become busy. By lunch, I had become focused. By dinner, I had become professionally courteous, which is the emotional equivalent of placing furniture against a door. When Solène asked if I wanted to walk the next morning, I said I had pages. When she asked the following afternoon whether I had finished the novel she had lent me, I said not yet, though I had stayed up until 2, reading the last 100 pages and hating her for every sentence that moved me. When she sat near me in the common room, I remembered an email. When she did not sit near me, I remembered Dara's face in the conservatory and felt vindicated by pain I had manufactured with impressive speed. For 4 days, the residency became very large and very cold. It is astonishing how much architecture can expand when one person stops crossing it toward another. The dining room lengthened. The path around the lake grew formal. The terrace became a stage on which I performed, not noticing. Solène noticed immediately. Of course she did. The first day, her gaze followed me with quiet assessment. The second, she gave me the dignity of distance. The third, she became perfectly polite. That was worse than if she had pressed. Pressure would have let me accuse her. Politeness forced me to live with the absurdity of my own retreat. My work changed. The pages that had broken open after Dara's warning began to harden. My protagonist regained her elegance, that old armor masquerading as style. She stood in hotel rooms. She packed. She withheld. She punished herself and called it structure. I knew I was doing it. Knowing did not stop me. One afternoon, Min read beside me in the library for an hour before saying, without looking up, "You are writing defensively." I said, "I did not realize we were allowed to diagnose from across the table." "We are not." "I am gifted." I closed my laptop. She turned a page. "I do not know what happened, and I am not asking. But if your solution to feeling something is to make the work less alive, that seems inefficient." I stared at her. "Are you always this comforting?" "Only to people I like." I went to my room and deleted 2 pages, then restored them, then deleted them again. At dinner, Dara watched me watching Solin not watch me and looked sorry in a way I found unbearable. Theo, mercifully, said nothing. He only passed me the bread with the solemn expression of someone handing a soldier ammunition. The 4th night, rain returned, not as storm, but as persistence, a fine silver net over the grounds. I stood at my window and saw Solène on the dock below, smoking under a black umbrella. She looked up at my window, though there was no reason to know I stood there. I stepped back before she could see me. The childishness of it made my throat burn. That night, I did not sleep. I lay in bed, cataloging every reason distance was wise. She was older. She was famous. She was leaving. I was leaving. Residency romances were pressure systems, beautiful and unserious. Desire in enclosed artistic environments should be treated with the same suspicion as mushrooms found near the road. People had warned me. Dara had warned me kindly, which was the worst kind. Solène herself had warned me, though perhaps not in words. I have written many warnings. I have mistaken most of them for self-portraits only later. I repeated the warnings until they became less like caution and more like prayer. Beneath them, something smaller and more humiliating told the truth. I had not withdrawn because I believed Solène had deceived me. I had withdrawn because for 1 second in a hallway at dawn, I had heard her give warmth to someone else and discovered how badly I wanted to be the person who received it. Wanting had made me ordinary. It had made me available to injury. So I did what I had always done when the room became too bright. I turned out the light and called it discipline. On the 5th evening of my controlled demolition, Solène knocked on my door. I knew it was her before I opened it. This was not romance. It was pattern recognition. No one else at Ashwood knocked only once, waited, and trusted the sound to have been enough. I had been sitting at my desk with my laptop open to a sentence I had revised 12 times into rigor mortis. The room smelled of cold coffee, and the dahlias on my sill had begun to drop petals with the exhausted dignity of actresses after curtain call. When I opened the door, Solène stood in the hall wearing a white shirt, black trousers, no shoes, her hair loose around her shoulders. The lack of shoes undid me more than beauty would have. Bare feet made her look less like a reputation and more like a person who had crossed a house because silence had become impossible. "May I come in?" she asked. I almost said I was working. We both would have heard the lie land between us and twitch. Instead, I stepped back. My room, which had seemed austere and private all month, became instantly small with her inside it. She did not sit. She stood near the foot of the bed, leaving me the chair, the desk, the window, all my little fortifications. "What happened?" she asked. No preamble, no accusation, no theatrical hurt, just the question, placed in the center of the room like a glass no one could pretend not to see. I said, "Nothing." Solène looked at me. Waverly, my name again, and this time not a sentence, but a door I could either open or die leaning against. I crossed my arms. "It is not your responsibility to manage my moods." "No," she said. "But it is my responsibility not to pretend I do not see them when they are aimed at me." That should have irritated me. It did. It also made avoidance feel suddenly adolescent. I turned toward the window. Outside, the lake was the color of old steel. "I overheard you on the phone," I said. The sentence was ridiculous once spoken, smaller than the pain it had carried. Solène did not move. When? A few mornings ago, by the pantry. You were speaking French. You sounded. I stopped. There are words that make the speaker naked, no matter how clinically they are arranged. She waited. I said, You sounded like you loved someone. Solenne's face changed, not with guilt or confusion, but with understanding so swift it almost hurt to watch. Ah, she said softly. My sister. The room did not collapse. The revelation was too ordinary. It simply removed the stage beneath the drama I had built and left me standing in costume over a hole. She lives in Lyon, Solène continued. Her daughter had a fever. She was frightened. I call her mon cœur because when she was small, she could not say my name and called me that. She studied me. Is that what you thought? That I had a lover somewhere? I laughed once, without humor. Thought is generous. I constructed. I am very good at constructing. Yes, Solène said. I have noticed. The gentleness in her voice made my eyes sting, which I resented fiercely. I wanted her to be smug or offended. I wanted her to give me something hard enough to push against. Instead, she stood there barefoot on my wooden floor and looked at me as if my ugliness had not surprised her out of tenderness. I said, Everyone warned me about you. The words came harsher than I intended. Solène's expression did not close. Was, I know, they have reasons. That disarmed me. I had expected denial, superiority, the elegant boredom of the misunderstood. I had not expected acknowledgement. Dara said you disappeared while sitting beside her. Solène inhaled slowly. Dara is not wrong. Were they all not wrong? No. The honesty struck harder than defense. She looked toward my desk, at the pages stacked beside the laptop, then back at me. I have been loved by people who wanted the part of my attention that made them feel chosen, and hated the part of my honesty that made choice complicated. I have also been careless, not with promises perhaps, but with presence. Sometimes I gave a person the full force of my attention because in that hour it was true, and I did not understand that they would build a future out of it. That is my failure. I wanted to ask if I was one of those people, if I had mistaken an hour for a future, if the wrist at the bar meant nothing beyond reflex, if the candlelit common room had been another example of her being present in a way that would later evaporate. But the questions were too vulnerable to survive the air. Solène seemed to hear them anyway. She said, With you, I have been careful because I did not want to be careless. That sentence moved through me slowly. Careful can be its own cruelty. Yes, I know. For the first time since she entered, she looked away. The hallway beyond my open door remained empty, but the house made small sounds around us. A pipe knocking, laughter far downstairs, rain beginning again at the eaves. Solène said, The last woman I loved was named Iris, a painter, 4 years ago. The name entered the room like someone with a key. I sat down because my legs had become theoretical. Solène remained standing for a moment, then lowered herself to the edge of the bed with the caution of a person approaching a memory that might still bite. We lived together in Brooklyn for 9 months, she said. She had a studio in Red Hook that smelled of turpentine and oranges because she ate them constantly while she worked. She painted enormous canvases, all color and violence, and then she would come home and ask me to tell her exactly what I saw. Not kindly. Exactly. I loved her for that at first. Her mouth moved with something that was not quite a smile. She was brave in the way artists are when the work is watching. Less brave when love required the same thing. I listened. I had thought Solène's past would make her more distant, but the opposite happened. Each detail made her human with almost unbearable force. She told me Iris loved parties, noise, arguments at midnight, friends arriving without warning, the public proof of passion. Solène loved quiet, long work, solitude that did not mean absence, truth delivered without witnesses. At first they treated difference as erotic. Later they treated it as debt. Iris wanted warmth she could recognize from across a room. Solène tried to provide it. She stayed longer at dinners, touched more in public, softened opinions, accepted invitations, translated silence into smiles until she became fluent in a woman she was not. I thought love meant adaptation, she said. Some of it does. But I did not adapt. I edited. I cut away anything that frightened her. And because she loved the edited version, I kept revising myself. Her hands rested on her knees. The scar on her knuckle had gone pale. I did not leave her, Solène said. I disappeared. I kept waiting for her to want the real version, and instead I kept making myself smaller and smaller until one day I looked in the mirror and couldn't find myself. The room blurred for a second, not with tears exactly, but with the body recognizing a sentence before the mind had approved it. She looked at me then. I have not done that since. And I will not do it for you either, as much as I want to. There it was, the terrible generosity of refusal. Not I will not hurt you. Not I will become safe. Not I choose you in the language you already understand. Something harder, cleaner. I will not vanish inside your fear. I felt anger rise because grief often wears anger when it first comes in from the cold. You make that sound noble, I said. Maybe it is just another way to leave first. Solène accepted the blow. Perhaps. Or perhaps staying as myself is the only form of staying I can offer without turning cruel later. My laugh shook. Convenient. Yes, she said. Truth often is when it belongs to someone else. I hated her then for not being easier to hate. I stood, walked to the window, came back, stopped near the desk, ran a hand through my hair, and understood with a distant, clinical horror that I was about to tell the truth. Not the polished truth, not the workshop truth, the kind that comes out carrying furniture. I said, I do not know how to want without preparing for humiliation. Solène went very still. I continued because the first wound had opened a gate. I heard you on the phone, and it was not that I believed you owed me anything. I know you do not. That was the worst part. I had no claim, so the jealousy had nowhere dignified to go. I wanted to be above it. I wanted to be the woman who could enjoy the conversation, the walk, the bar, the almost touch, and then return to herself unchanged. But I am not unchanged, and instead of admitting that, I made you into evidence. I used the warnings because they were available. I used Dara's pain. I used your reputation. I used one phrase through a door. My voice faltered, recovered. I built a case for leaving because I wanted you to be guilty before I became vulnerable. Solène's face had softened in a way that frightened me more than severity. She rose. Not toward me, just to stand. And now? She asked. Now I am embarrassed. That is not all. No, the word left me barely audible. No, it is not. We stood with the room between us and everything the room could no longer hold. The conversation did not resolve. Lives do not become clean because one brave sentence has finally been dragged into light. I still had fear in me, old and agile. Solène still had a history, not a villain's history, which might have been simpler, but the kind made of choices that had once seemed survivable. Yet something had been named, and naming is not healing, but it is the end of certain ghosts. She moved toward the door. I thought she was leaving, and panic flashed through me so bright it became physical. Not because she owed me more, because I had finally opened the door and found myself terrified by the possibility that truth might arrive too late. Solène paused with her hand on the knob. I am going downstairs, she said. Not away. Downstairs. I absorbed the distinction like warmth. I nodded. She left the door open behind her, not wide, not symbolic, just unlatched enough for the hall light to make a thin gold line across my floor. I lasted 11 minutes. I know because I watched them pass on the small travel clock beside my bed, each red digit changing with the smug indifference of machines. 11 minutes of standing in the center of my room with the door half open and the lake dark beyond the glass. 11 minutes of my body demanding movement while my mind held up legal objections. 11 minutes of discovering that composure, once praised as strength by people who benefited from it, is often only fear wearing good posture. Then I went after her. The hallway was empty. The house at night had layers of sound: distant conversation from the common room, rain against the windows, the low mutter of plumbing, someone's typewriter clacking in bursts from the West Wing because one resident had mistaken inconvenience for artistic seriousness. I moved toward the stairs without knowing what I intended to say. The absence of a plan would normally have stopped me. That night it felt like the only honest credential I possessed. Solène stood in the corridor outside the common room, not inside it, one shoulder against the wall, a glass of water in her hand. She looked up as if she had expected me and had also been afraid to expect me. The light from the room behind her edged her hair and left her face in partial shadow. I stopped several feet away. My heart was performing acts of percussion entirely unrelated to music. I said, "You said you would not make yourself smaller for me." "Correct. I do not want you smaller." My voice came out unsteady, which should have embarrassed me but did not. "I want you difficult and exact, and sometimes impossible. I want you honest, even when it ruins my preferred version of the scene. I want you to stop looking at me as if you already know where the trapdoor is, though I understand you probably do. I want—" The sentence broke because wanting, once released, did not arrive in civilized order. Solène set the glass on a narrow table beside the wall. Her attention did not move from me. "What do you want, Waverly?" It was the same question the whole month had been asking in different clothes. What do you want when no one is admiring your restraint? What do you want when the exit is available and the room is not on fire? What do you want when the woman everyone warned you about stands before you without defense and refuses to become simpler for your comfort? I stepped closer. I want to stop making fear sound intelligent. Solène closed her eyes briefly, as if the sentence had touched somewhere bruised. When she opened them, I was close enough to see the amber at the center again. The hall narrowed around us. We were not hidden. Anyone could have walked out of the common room and found us standing there with a month of weather between our bodies. That should have mattered. It did not. I said, "I do not know what I am doing." Solène's mouth curved with unbearable tenderness. Finally, she whispered. The word broke something in me, not dramatically, not with shattering glass or orchestral weather, but with the simple animal surrender of recognition. I had spent years being articulate about longing and illiterate in its presence. I had mistaken the map for the country, the sentence for the skin, the door for the departure. I reached up. My hand touched the side of her face before I understood I had moved. Her skin was warm. She inhaled, and the restraint I had felt in her for days, maybe since the beginning, trembled under my palm. She did not take. She waited even then, which ruined me. I rose onto my toes and kissed her. Or she kissed me. Later I would try to assign action, but the truth was less tidy. There was a meeting, a permission, a held breath finally allowed to become air. Solène kissed me like someone finally permitted to do the thing she had been holding back with both hands. Tender first, almost unbearably tender, as if asking my mouth whether it was real, as if learning the fact of me through contact might require patience. Then the tenderness deepened into something close to desperation. Her palm came to my face, cradling my cheek with a care so complete it felt like being steadied at the edge of myself. Her other hand found my waist, not pulling exactly, but anchoring. I had been kissed before. I had enjoyed kisses, initiated them, ended them, filed them in the bright drawers of experience. This was not that. This was being found in a room I had pretended did not exist. My hands went to her shoulders, then her neck, then into the dark fall of her hair. She made a sound against my mouth, low and startled, and I understood with a force almost painful that she had been afraid too. Not of me alone, of the repetition of old rooms, of being wanted as atmosphere and punished as weather, of touching a woman who might ask her to be less and then resent the absence. The kiss changed when I understood that. It became less like falling and more like answering. I opened to her, and Solenne's restraint faltered. She stepped forward until my back met the wall, gently enough that I could have left, firmly enough that my body understood I did not want to. The house continued around us. Someone laughed in the common room. Rain moved along the gutters. A floorboard creaked above. The ordinary world, inconsiderate and alive, failed to recognize that I was crossing a border with my mouth. Solène drew back first, not far, just enough for breath. Her forehead dropped to mine. Her eyes remained closed. I could feel her breathing, uneven now, feel the tremor in the hand still at my waist. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Speech would have made the thing smaller, and yet silence had done enough damage. Then she whispered, "I've been waiting for you to break first." The line could have been cruel in another mouth, triumphant, predatory, proof that everyone had been right. In hers, it landed with such relief my eyes burned. She did not mean she had waited to win. She meant she had recognized the performance because she had once lived inside it. She meant she had been holding her own fear still, refusing to force the door, trusting that if I came through, it had to be by my own hand. She meant she, the woman everyone had warned me about, had been the more frightened one all along. I laughed, though it came out almost like a sob. That is an alarming thing to say to someone in a hallway. Her thumb moved along my cheek. I know, I am trying to be less quotable in intimate moments. You are failing catastrophically, historically. She smiled, and I kissed her again because humor had become the only way to survive tenderness without drowning in it. "We should not do this in a hallway," she said. I said, "That is the first practical thing either of us has said in weeks." Her laugh was soft, almost disbelieving. I can go. The offer was real. It hurt me in the exact place it healed. "I do not want you to go," I said. The sentence was small, plain, stripped of architecture. It cost more than any elegant confession I had ever written. Solène heard the cost. She nodded once. Then we go slowly. I nodded too because speech had become unreliable. We walked upstairs not touching, which felt more intimate than if we had clung to each other. At my door, I looked at the thin gold line of light still falling across the floor from where she had left it unlatched earlier. I thought of all the doors in my work, all the hotel rooms and elevators and thresholds. I opened this one. Solène entered after me. The room did not transform. The dahlias still dropped petals. My laptop still glowed on the desk. The lake remained dark beyond the trees. But the air had changed because I had. She stood by the window and let me come to her. That mattered. Everything mattered suddenly. Every pause, every breath, every place where choice could have been rushed and was not. When I touched her, she closed her eyes like a woman allowing pain and pleasure to share a name. When she touched me, she did it with a patience that made heat more devastating, not less. Later, much later, we lay facing each other in the narrow bed while rain softened against the roof. Her fingers traced the inside of my wrist where the bar had begun and the hallway had finished. I asked, "Were you really waiting?" She looked at my wrist instead of my face. "I was hoping," she said. "Waiting sounds more confident. You are very committed to revision. Occupational hazard." Then she grew quiet. "I would not have pushed you. I know. I wanted you to know before morning." I did. Solène's gaze lifted to mine. "And now, I said, because the word frightened me and therefore deserved use, we see whether I can stay in the room after telling the truth." She touched my face with the back of her fingers. "I am here." It was not a promise about forever. It was better. It was a fact, immediate and warm. And for once, I did not ask a fact to become a guarantee before I allowed it to comfort me. Morning did not punish us. It arrived gray and gentle through the branches, finding us in the narrow bed with the lake-breathing mist beyond the glass, and Solenne's hand curved around my wrist as if even in sleep she had chosen the place where the story began to change. We went downstairs 3 minutes apart and fooled no one. Min looked at my wrinkled blouse, then at Solenne's missing button, and returned to her toast with saintly restraint. Theo appeared to experience several revelations before coffee. Dara only gave me a small nod, not permission, not warning, but recognition. The remaining days of the residency did not become a fantasy, which may have been what saved them. We wrote. We ate with other people. We argued about sentences. We learned the strange tenderness of wanting each other in a house not built for privacy, the brush of a hand in the pantry, a shoulder touching mine on the dock at dawn, Solène leaving coffee by my laptop, and disappearing before gratitude could become theater. Fear still returned, but now I tried to name it before turning it into evidence. Once, after watching her laugh with Dara, I told her jealousy had arrived wearing my face. Solène did not comfort me with lies. She said Dara knew a part of her I did not, and that it did not diminish what I knew. I believed her only halfway at first. Halfway, I learned, was sometimes the honest beginning of trust. My pages changed again. In workshop, the protagonist stopped leaving beautifully and stayed awkwardly, frightened and plain and alive. Solène read the new ending on the floor of my room with my pen behind her ear and said the work had finally stopped punishing itself for being known. Then she told me to cut the final line because it was impressive instead of true. I hated the note so much I knew it was correct. When I wrote the plainer sentence, she read it twice and said, "There. That is the book." On the last night, we sat on the dock under a blanket while Ashwood glowed behind us with the restless sorrow of departure. I asked what happened when we left. Solène said we would return to our lives, write badly, miss trains, answer messages late, and learn whether this belonged only to the lake or could survive fluorescent stations and ordinary weeks. It was not the romantic answer. It was better. She promised not to disappear because truth became inconvenient. I promised to ask a question before building an exit. We kissed beside the black water, slowly, without pretending time had been defeated. Leaving did not restore control the way it once had. On the train south, my phone buzzed before Poughkeepsie. Solène had written, "I dislike the house already without you in it." A second message followed. That was too elegant. Revision. "I miss you." I answered with the least impressive truth I had. "I miss you too." 2 months later, her book tour brought her through Philadelphia on a wet Thursday that made the whole city smell of pavement, leaves, and trains. By then, my manuscript had gone back to my editor with a new ending and fewer places to hide. By then, Solène and I had survived misunderstandings, silences, one small jealousy sharp enough to draw blood, and the practice of returning to the conversation instead of the exit. I stood at the back of the bookstore while she read, watching the woman everyone had warned me about trust a room full of strangers with difficult hope. Afterward, she came to my apartment carrying Thai takeout and a bottle of wine, damp hair tucked into her coat, eyes steady on mine as if this were not a grand arrival, but the natural continuation of a sentence we had both finally stopped revising away. My apartment did not become more impressive with her in it. It became more mine because she saw it. The brick wall view, the jammed kitchen drawer, the couch repaired with a folded coaster, the manuscript pages covering the coffee table. We ate on the floor and drank wine from mismatched mugs because the clean glasses were in the dishwasher and because some symbols deserve retirement. In the copy of her novel, she had signed for me, she had written, "For Waverley," who knows now that the truest rooms are not the ones without exits, but the ones we choose not to leave. I read it twice and could not make a joke quickly enough to protect myself. I told her I was still afraid. "Good," she said, because fear meant I was present with something to lose, and we only had to make sure it did not become the only voice in the room. Later, after the food cooled and the rain softened against the fire escape, Solène fell asleep on my couch with her head in my lap, while I read the final page of my manuscript again. The last line was plain. Less impressive. True. I rested one hand over hers and listened to my apartment accepting another person's breathing. There was no declaration large enough to frighten truth away. No vow, polished for applause. Just Solon at my door with takeout and wine. The manuscript changed because I had changed, and the quiet confidence of a love that had known where it was going before I did, then waited, patiently and imperfectly, for me to know it too.